Chers amis, chers collègues, chers participants, j'ai le grand plaisir et l'honneur de vous accueillir au nom de la Fondation Trudeau pour ce moment qui est toujours très attendu dans le colloque, celui de la présentation exclusive des résultats d'une enquête à l'échelle nationale qui nous permet de saisir l'opinion des Canadiennes et des Canadiens par rapport aux 4 thèmes de la Fondation Trudeau. Le Canada dans le monde, les populations dans leur environnement naturel, la citoyenneté responsable, les droits de la personne et la dignité humaine. Mon nom est Margarida Garcia, je suis une ancienne boursière Trudeau. Je suis aussi aujourd'hui professeure aux facultés de droit et de sciences sociales de l'Université d'Ottawa. Alors, bienvenue. Merci d'être là. J'avais oublié cette éthique du travail intellectuel qui est proposée à chaque rencontre de cette incroyable institution. La discussion sur les grandes idées et les conversations productives commence à l'aube, même si c'est samedi. Et donc, merci beaucoup d'être ici. Et donc, c'est à 8 heures de ce beau matin que nous serons confrontés à ce moment de vérité par rapport au thème retenu. Qui sommes-nous en tant que société? C'est vraiment ça la question qui va être posée ici. Alors, sans plus tarder, je vous présente celui qui va nous dévoiler le portrait de nos aspirations collectives, de nos forces, de nos faiblesses, notre conférencier, le grand chef d'orchestre de cette enquête, Monsieur Keith Neuman. Alors, Keith Neuman est le directeur exécutif d'Environics Institute, un organisme de recherche innovateur à but non lucratif et qui a comme mission de promouvoir au Canada l'opinion publique indépendante et de même que la recherche sociale sur d'importants enjeux reliés aux politiques publiques et aux changements sociaux. Alors, depuis la création de l'Institut en 2006, il a dirigé des travaux de recherche que l'on peut qualifier vraiment d'avant-gardistes. Je mentionnerai à titre d'exemple la toute première enquête au Canada sur les musulmans, l'étude sur les autochtones en milieu urbain et la première enquête nationale sur ce que signifie pour les Canadiens que d'être un bon citoyen, une bonne citoyenne. Alors, avant cette assignation, Keith Neuman avait déjà mené des enquêtes en matière d'opinion publique et de recherche sociale pour des organisations des secteurs publics, privés et à but non lucratif. Il est titulaire d'un doctorat en écologie sociale de l'Université de Californie. Il intervient aussi fréquemment sur la scène médiatique, vous devez le savoir, comme commentateur des tendances sociales et des tendances de l'opinion publique. Et la conférence de cette année se veut être la 7e fois que Keith Neuman collabore avec la Fondation Trudeau pour la réalisation de son enquête annuelle sur l'opinion publique. Alors, je tiens à souligner la formule innovatrice qui a été retenue pour célébrer ce 10e colloque de la Fondation, les 4 sondages nationaux d'opinion publique à l'égard des thèmes explorés ont été élaborés en partenariat avec les 4 universités montréalaises. Donc, vraiment quelque chose de très intéressant. Alors, M. Neuman va présenter les résultats pendant environ une quarantaine de minutes et après, nous aurons 20 minutes d'échange dans lesquelles je vous inviterai à contribuer de façon engagée à la discussion des résultats de ce sondage. Donc, without further ado, dear members and friends of the Trudeau Foundation, please join me in welcoming Mr. Keith Neuman.
Thank you, Margarita. Good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to see all of you up this morning. I hear it's cold outside. It's indeed an honor to share the stage with other important thinkers and leaders who have preceded me at this conference. And of course, to work with the terrific team here at the Trudeau Foundation and to be in the territories of the Haudenosaunee here in Montreal. Yesterday, and I guess Thursday, you heard from some leading thinkers on some of the important themes that this conference is about. This morning, you will hear from a very different set of voices, the Canadian public at large. I guess I should get this going. As Margarida indicated, I'm going to provide an overview of the public opinion research that was done specifically for this conference, covers the 4 themes, and as has been indicated, there are important university sponsors that have been associated with these, and we've paired them up in what we think was a good way. Concordia University was responsible for responsible citizenship. Human Rights and Dignity, it was McGill University with whom we collaborated. People in Their Natural Environment, it was UQAM. And finally, University of Montreal, it was Canada and the World. And I do want to express my appreciation to those universities and to those academic colleagues that I collaborated with. We started, I think, back in May to figure out how we would approach this particular survey. And I can tell you that each of these surveys presents a bit of a challenge in terms of figuring out how to come up with some interesting and innovative research to present every year with just a handful of survey questions. So before we get to the research, I do want to address a question that some of you may be asking. And the question is, why survey the public? In terms of the kinds of weighty issues and challenges that we've been talking about, and as we've seen, they're pretty serious, pretty daunting. What is it that the general average Canadian can possibly contribute to our understanding of these major issues and how we may address them? And why is it that the Trudeau Foundation and the academic sponsors continue to invest resources in doing such a survey every year? So I think that's a question I'd like to address before I get into the research. And if you're asking this kind of question, you may be accustomed to thinking about research or surveys or polls as something like this. Typical political poll showcasing a horse race being of limited short-term variety, but we seem to see an awful lot of this, certainly in Canada, not just at elections, but all the time. So I think when I'm talking to people in this country about surveys and polls, they tend to think about this kind of activity, and they rightly raise some questions about, well, what's it really? Is it really valuable? Is it valid? Why are we doing this? But there are really other reasons why this kind of research is really important. It helps us address some fundamental questions, which I think we can all agree are important. Who are we as individuals and collectively? What do we think and believe as a people and a society? What are our priorities and expectations? So these are, I think you would agree, pretty fundamental questions. And we learn answers to these questions in a number of ways, certainly from people we know, friends, neighbors, and so forth, from the media, traditional, and increasingly from social media as well. Certainly from art and literature, we learn a lot about ourselves that way. And from advertising and marketing, whether we like it or not, it actually tells us a lot about ourselves individually and as a people. But, and I'm sure this audience will agree, social sciences play an important role in helping us appreciate who we are. So I don't think that's a hard argument to make here. Survey research, which is a particular kind of social science, is only one avenue, but it's one that has a unique role to play, that I would argue. It's a way of expanding the dialogue about issues to all segments of society, and in particular those for whom the voice is not usually heard. It provides an essential check to how elites and the media may define public opinion. We all know how we hear about that and see about that. Sometimes surveys cut through that very effectively. Helps identify myths and misperceptions that perhaps need to be called to attention. And I think, as a bottom line, survey research, if properly done and interpreted and presented, can provide a basis for understanding and empathy in our society. It actually provides us with a way of helping to understand what it's like to be someone else. Let me just give you just one brief example from my own experience with Aboriginal peoples. As we all know, it's a very common view in this country to think about Aboriginal peoples in terms of dire poverty on reserves, or homeless people lying around in our cities hopelessly addicted or sick or whatever. These are the kinds of images we tend to see in the media. These are the sorts of images that we all too often seem to associate with First Nations and Aboriginal peoples. But we know it's not the full picture. Through research, properly done research, which is not enough of it being done, but some of it, we can appreciate better that Aboriginal peoples is about their culture, about their music, about successful people in entertainment like Adam Beach, passing on traditions from generation to generation, being successful in terms of educational achievement, and finally, like everyone else, striving to enjoy the good life with recreation and travel and so forth. These are not the sort of images that we tend to associate with Aboriginal peoples, but in fact, it's accurate, and it's really important to realize, and we can do this through research, that in fact, this population is not that different from the rest of us, although they have their distinct qualities. So, I hope I've made the point. On to the research. So, as we do every year, there's a national survey that is conducted as part of this conference. In this case, once again, it was a telephone survey with a sample of Canadians 18 years and over. The survey was done just a month or so ago, so the results are fairly recent. So I'm not going to go through the whole survey. You have backgrounders in your packages where you can read all of the details. But I do want to cover some of the high points and try and weave a story here about some of the themes and findings. And I've included a bit of additional research from other sources just to provide some context. Let me start with the first theme, which is responsible citizenship. Two sub-themes that we addressed in this part of the survey: society's responsibility to assist people in need, and respecting the aspirations in terms of Aboriginal self-government. Those are big themes. How can we possibly cover that in a short survey? Well, we're just starting in. I think it's fair to say that one of the country's sort of defining aspects as it thinks about itself and how it sets itself apart is our social programs and social safety net, which has not been around since Confederation, but in the last number of decades has been what I think argue is a fairly cherished part of our country and what makes us distinctive. And universality has always been an important part of that, in that all members of society have equal access to these programs. But perhaps these programs are under a bit of threat or pressure from budget pressures and perhaps ideology. So we did want to ask a question about the principle of universality and access to social and economic assistance. And you can see from the results, and hopefully everybody can see the slide, that a clear majority, 2/3 of Canadians, believe in principle in the fact that social and economic assistance should be available to everybody, not simply just to those who are most in need. Maybe this isn't surprising, but these sorts of questions aren't asked that often, and it's important to check in on this. It also suggests that any movement towards means testing is not something that the Canadian public is necessarily looking for or would perhaps be satisfied to see. At the same time, this doesn't mean that the public doesn't perhaps see or recognize or believe that there are some groups in society that are more vulnerable and need more help than others. So we asked another question, and we presented 3 vulnerable groups and asked which of the 3 was most in need of greater government assistance than they're getting now. And we got a pretty clear result on this particular question. Of these 3 groups, it's families with children in poverty, which is by far the group that is seen as the most vulnerable and the one that's in greatest need of more government assistance, in comparison with young adults struggling to get their first job, which is clearly an issue, and individuals who have been unemployed for a year or more. So fairly clear a direction from the public on this. We forced the choice, but of course we always have people in our survey that insist that our choices aren't the full range, and about 10% insisted that all 3 were equally important. Another approach to economic assistance, one that has yet to be tried in this country or anywhere else, is the idea of guaranteeing everybody income. It's a type of universality that perhaps is a bit revolutionary, but was experimented with in the 60s and has been talked about in the concept of a guaranteed annual income. You don't hear much about it except from Senator Hugh Segal, who has been very articulate on this matter, but is not being looked at seriously, probably is considered a political non-starter because Canadians simply would not accept this kind of approach of just giving free money to people. Well, this is a kind of question that we thought was appropriate to put on the survey. I'm not aware of any previous survey question on this topic. So we explained it in a survey question and asked, what do you think of this? And the results are kind of interesting. There is no overwhelming view for or against this concept of a guaranteed annual income. Opinion is sort of split. About 46% of Canadians think that's a good idea, and 42% think it's not. So you could look at that in various ways. To me, what it tells me is there actually would be a foundation of public support if some courageous politician wanted to take this forward. It is useful to look at this by income, which is obviously a relevant characteristic, and it is notable, if not surprising, that you see that opinions about this issue do vary by income. And it's those at the top end of the pyramid, 100,000 or more, maybe that's the top 5% of the population, are the ones least supportive, least amenable to providing a guaranteed income to those who are much less fortunate than themselves. Perhaps this is what we would expect, I don't know. Let me move to the second theme, which is Aboriginal self-government. And as we know, and as Sean Atleo has very articulately said on Thursday, Aboriginal peoples have been fighting for greater self-determination for a long time, at least once they were past the point where they had to worry so much about self-preservation. Sean Atleo has put forth the call to us to help in terms of helping Aboriginal peoples gain more self-determination. And so what does the Canadian public think about this particular idea? Should Aboriginal peoples have self-government? Well, a clear majority in this survey said yes, and you have still a minority, but not a large minority saying no, this shouldn't be the case. So this does suggest that there is some public openness. It's also useful to look at this over time because this, in fact, is a question that Environics has asked on previous surveys going back 20 years. And I think perhaps what's interesting to look at here is there actually has been not dramatic, but an evolution in public opinion about the concept of Aboriginal self-government that has gradually built since 1990. So not a major change, but the change has been in a certain direction and does suggest that there is perhaps a growing recognition and support for the concept. If we look at the results across provinces, across the country, it's useful to look at because we can see there are some differences. The rising support is most clear in British Columbia, Ontario, Quebec, and Atlantic Canada. And if you look at it a bit more closely, you can see that it's the prairie provinces where there tends to be less support and where the support actually dropped from 1997 to 2013. So it does suggest that there's a bit of a division in this country on the matter of Aboriginal government and related issues. At the same time, I don't want to make too much of a difference, much of a deal of the difference, because if you look at the dark bars across the country, you can see that the differences is not dramatic. It's a matter of degree. So Aboriginal self-government, great, sort of interesting idea. What does that really mean? What do Canadians think it means in terms of self-government? So there was a follow-up question to the question that I've just presented. We presented three options in terms of which of these three would make the most sense, and we can see a clear result. Most Canadians felt that the level of government ought to be similar to a municipality, that is, still answerable to provincial and federal laws. A smaller group felt that a provincial level authority or jurisdiction made sense. Very few Canadians, about 3%, felt that Aboriginal government should sort of be at a nation level. So not a consensus, but sort of a clear preference, which perhaps we can understand. There's trend data on this question as well, and we can see that opinions have not really changed that much over 20 years. I think Canadians are most comfortable with Aboriginal people managing their own communities, but maybe not at a provincial level. But it's interesting that the provincial level numbers have gone up in the past 20 years, and this is notably in Atlantic Canada, Saskatchewan, and British Columbia. And finally, what about outstanding treaty obligations? Something else that Sean Atleo has brought to our attention at this conference. What obligation does our current government have in terms of honoring First Nations treaties regardless of cost? And we frame this question as a moral obligation. This is a question that had not been asked before, but we thought was worth asking. And here's the answer. About 6 in 10 Canadians, in fact, believe there is a moral obligation for our current government to resolve these outstanding treaties. People may not understand all the details of these treaties, but the sentiment is clearly there. Again, useful to look at this sort of data by province to see that it's not uniform across the country. It is, again, the prairie provinces where opinions are more divided. There's not substantial opposition, but it's fair to say that Canadians in the prairie provinces are conflicted, divided, opinion is split. Whereas if you look at Ontario or Quebec or even BC, you can see that a majority of Canadians feel that this is an important thing to consider. Not on the slide, but also to mention that it's Canadians with lower incomes that are also more supportive, more sensitive to Aboriginal aspirations, and also immigrants from outside Europe and the United States. So from less developed countries are more supportive of Aboriginal aspirations here. And it calls to mind, I think, the reference made on Thursday night about the potential links between the newest immigrants in this country and the very first peoples to occupy this land. Then, in fact, there may be some sort of sympathy or connection going on there. All right, lots to cover still. The second theme, human rights and dignity. Canada's record on protecting human rights at home and abroad, and the extent to which people feel that there is discrimination against certain groups in our society. What about people's view of Canada's record on protecting human rights? Here are the results of this question. You could look at this as good news or bad news. More than half of Canadians feel that the record is either excellent or good, as opposed to only fair or poor. You don't see a lot of people who say excellent, and there's still a significant minority of people that feel that the record has not been terrific. So this is not, I would say, an outstanding kind of result. It's also good to point out that relatively few Canadians feel strongly positive or strongly negative. So it suggests that it is not an issue that's particularly sensitive to most in the population. Again, if you look at this by income, you can see that there is a difference. It is Canadians with the lowest incomes who are least likely to feel that the record has been good. It does suggest there's a bit of a class issue going on here at some level. And it's also interesting to look at the results by place of birth. Again, it's immigrants from outside Western countries who are a bit more positive than others about the human rights record. And perhaps we could understand this in terms of them making a comparison to where they came from. How do we compare ourselves with other Western democracies? We have two data points here. And we can see that very few Canadians think that we've done a worse job on human rights than other Western countries. And the rest are sort of split between those who think we're better and those who think we're about the same. And we can also see that there's been very little change over the last 3 years. The 2010 data, by the way, was asked in the Trudeau Foundation conference survey in 2010, for those of you that may have been at that conference. What about the frequency of discrimination against minority groups in our society? We identified 5 groups that we wanted to ask about. The extent to which there's discrimination, often, sometimes, rarely, or never. At the top of the list, maybe this would surprise some people, Aboriginal peoples. Almost half of Canadians feel that Aboriginal peoples are frequently subject to discrimination. Next, we have Muslims at 42%, new immigrants, some overlap here, but a distinct category, gays and lesbians, and finally blacks. If you look at sort of all the pink bars, you can see that almost all Canadians believe that there is some level of discrimination. But the gradation is very important, and I think it's best to pay attention to the dark parts, the people that say often, because those are the people that are really, really clearly saying that they think that there's an issue. How have these perceptions changed over time? Again, these are questions that we've asked before, so we can have a look at that. Hopefully you can see these lines. What it shows basically is that over the last 10 years or so, that perceptions of discrimination against Aboriginal peoples has gradually risen over this period of time. Not dramatically, but it is going up. Whereas perceptions about discrimination against Muslims has remained remarkably flat. It's still high, but it has not changed. And for blacks, it went up a little bit, and then it's been declining. So these perceptions have been moving in different directions, which is very interesting. It's also interesting maybe to compare perceptions of Canadians and Americans. We always seem to be interested in comparing ourselves in that way. In terms of Muslims, fairly similar views about the perception of discrimination. But when you look at gays and lesbians and blacks, you can see that there's a big difference. Americans are much more likely to feel there's discrimination against gays and lesbians and blacks, and I think most likely there's factual truth to that, to those perceptions. Finally, on this topic, who do Canadians blame for the level of discrimination and inequality that some of these groups experience? So we asked first for immigrants, and we gave 3 categories, and what we can see is that the public is sort of divided between those who think it's the policies of government, it's the attitudes of Canadian people, or it's the immigrants themselves. It's sort of equally split in terms of who is sort of mostly responsible. And again, this is a forced choice question, so we're asking people to pick the one they think is most significant. It's a bit different for Aboriginal peoples. It's interesting that Canadians are much less likely to hold themselves collectively responsible for the plight of Aboriginal peoples who they agree are being discriminated against. So there's a bit of interesting dissociation here which we may want to talk about in our discussion. The third theme, people and their natural environment. 2 sub-themes here. How important is the environment as a national priority? And this was certainly a topic discussed yesterday with Bill Rees and Art Hansen. And the extent to which environmental problems are seen as a hazard to health. I think this came up in yesterday's discussion about how in our system and our society, economics is dominant, and the economic system holds sway, and that the environment is really not given its due, and that part of the problem is Canadians are sort of buying into those priorities and consider the economy to be more important than the environment. That's certainly a narrative that we're very used to seeing, have seen that for a long time. And certainly if you look at the first question on this topic in our survey, this would seem to confirm this. We asked people, what's the most important problem facing Canada today? We did not give them any responses, so they couldn't pick from a list. They had to tell us what was in their heads. And you can see that the economy, interest rates, unemployment is at the top. The environment, climate change is on the list, but it's a little farther down. So this would suggest, in fact, that there is a sense that people really are much more focused on the economy and jobs, and the environment kind of fits later on. And some trend data on the very same kind of question that we've asked for a number of years really sort of confirms this when you ask this sort of question, that if you could see the green line, the environment very rarely is at the top of the list of major national concerns. It did pop up in 2007 when climate change sort of emerged as a big global issue, but then dropped back down with the recession. So we seem to settle on what seems to be a basic truth, that really it is about the economy, stupid, and the environment kind of fits in where it can. But what if we asked a slightly different kind of question in a different way? What if we asked a question about future problems and problems that really kind of need to be addressed if we're going to continue being a viable country? So we asked a different kind of question, like this, unprompted in the same kind of way, and we get a different result. The environment ends up being at the top of the list as the problem or the issue that Canadians are most likely to say is the #1 thing that we need to address that's going to be a problem if nothing is done about it. It's a very different result than the other one that I showed you. And it's not a fluke, because we've seen this on other surveys. We've seen it in surveys in the US and in Sweden. It really does suggest that how you ask the question makes a difference. Very, very quickly, some recent research we just released this past week with the David Suzuki Foundation that shows basically that a majority and a gradually rising majority of Canadians do believe that climate change is real and the problem is us. So it does, again, confirm that, in fact, the environment is in people's minds. It sort of depends how you ask the question. Going back to the other question very quickly, most important future problem, I thought I would show you the results across provinces just to give you some sense. You can see that the focus on the economy is a future problem, fairly consistent across the country, but the environment does stand out in 2 provinces, British Columbia and Quebec. So I think, I'm not spending much time on regional numbers here, but I think it's worth pointing out that it's those 2 provinces where this issue is most salient. The second sub-theme is about the impacts of the environment on health. Certainly, human health is pretty critical in terms of environmental quality and pollution, although it's not an aspect that we tend to hear as much about, because it's where environmental issues become concrete and personal to individuals, where people can really be affected in a way that is something very close to themselves. So we asked a question that was sort of a personal question: to what extent do people think environmental problems affect their own personal health? And here are the results from 2013. Almost all Canadians, 9 in 10, believe that, yeah, the environment affects my health somewhat in some way, but a fairly small number, 16%, you may not think that's so small, really believe that it's a significant impact. So you can see that there's sort of a range here in terms of people's views about this. The important part of the story is how this has changed or not over time, because this is a question that we've been asking for a number of years. And the basic story here is that these perceptions have changed surprisingly little over the past 20 years. We might have expected some sort of growth or evolution as there new evidence and sophistication and education and younger people coming along. This hasn't really been the case. You can see that perceptions today are about the same as 1992. They kind of increased a bit and then they went back down. So what it, I think, tells me is that environmental problems, environmental quality, for most Canadians is not particularly personal or concrete. And there are very important implications for that. Looking at the results of this question by income, some suggestive results. Back in 2011, there wasn't much difference in perceptions of this in response to this question by income group. But in 2013, there seems to be a shift. Lower income people, people that are broadly more vulnerable in general, are also feeling more vulnerable in terms of the impact of environmental forces on their own health. Now, it's a little premature to suggest that this is a trend or a major finding, but it is suggestive that there may be, again, an income or even class dimension of this that may be forming. We also asked Canadians their perceptions about the most significant environmental impacts on human health. So what parts of environmental pollution or problems are the ones that affect health the most? Again, an open-ended question because we really want to understand people's knowledge. And the result here, these are sort of the top mentions, actually are very consistent with other surveys that we've done and seen. Air pollution, if you ask Canadians the most significant environmental problem or the one that affects health, air pollution is always number one. And it seems to be that way across the country as well. Water pollution is usually second, then climate change comes up. You can see that there's sort of an ordering here that of some issues more than others. It's fairly generic. Most people aren't particularly informed and don't have a lot of specific information. And these sorts of perceptions have been fairly stable over time. We took this one step further and we presented a number of types of environmental hazards and asked in each case the level to which they have been a significant hazard to the environment. So there are actually 12 on the list. I won't spend a lot of time on this slide. But again, focus on the darkest part of the bars, the major risk. And we can see that sort of these well-known lifestyle hazards of obesity and heart disease are the ones that people are most likely to see as major health risks. Chemical pollution is actually fairly close to that. And then you go down through some other environmental problems, and then you get some weather-related issues which actually do have health implications but aren't seen that way. And I think the only point I want to make at this point is that the environmental hazards sort of occupy a space sort of below the well-known lifestyle hazards, but above the weather-related ones like flooding and extreme heat and so forth, which Canadians don't tend to think of in terms of health impacts. And then finally, how have these sorts of perceptions changed over time? We do have one previous data point from 2008 from a Health Canada study, and I'm putting the slide up here just to show you that the perceptions of the level of risk of these specific environmental hazards has not really changed in the last 5 years. In fact, in some cases, like air pollution, chemical pollution, they've declined. So again, I think the health connection to environmental problems in the minds of most Canadians is not strengthening or evolving forward, it's perhaps taking a step backward. Perhaps not good news, but there you have it. The final theme, Canada in the world. 3 sub-themes for this one. Canada's foreign policy priorities, support for military peacemaking missions, and who are our friends and enemies. Starting with Canada's foreign policy priorities, again, this was a topic yesterday, I think, in our sessions. We presented 4 priorities, and we asked in each case whether they wanted the current government to do more, do less, or do about the same. And here are the 4. At the top of the list, it's actually about climate change. Fairly poignant given what's just happened in Warsaw this past week. Canadians, a clear majority of Canadians would like to see the federal government do more in terms of working with other countries to address climate change. Second is expanding trade abroad. Third is providing development aid to other countries. At the bottom of the list, the one that has the lowest priority is doing more to combat international terrorism. So this gives us a sense of where Canadians are in terms of priorities. We took it one step further because it's easy to say, well, I'd like to see the government do this, I'd like to see the government do that, but how much do people care? So we tested this by asking a second question. For those people that said, I'd like the government to do more, we said, if you'd like the government to do more, would you be willing to help support it through an additional $100 a year in federal taxes out of your own pocket? So we sort of tested it a bit. Here are the results. These are the percentages. We can see that at least half in every case of those people said yes, in principle, they would pay more money for this. It's actually providing more foreign assistance, and climate change are the ones for which there's the strongest sort of support of that kind. The other two, not so much. So perhaps what's most useful, and to finish up on this particular aspect of it, if you put the results of these 2 questions together, you really get the best, I guess, the best view. These are the percentage of people who say, I want my country to do more, and I'm willing to help pay for it. And again, you can see that climate change very clearly stands out as the highest priority. Almost 45% of Canadians would like to see their government do more. I don't know how much traction this research is going to get in Ottawa, but it's important for us to do it and for us to publish it. What about peacekeeping and peacemaking missions? Canada has been involved in many, okay, thank you. In a number of missions, including Afghanistan. Apart from the moral and political considerations in R2P, is there public support for Canada to once again go out and get involved with its military in another country? So we presented a scenario about participating in a mission to restore peace in a small African country. You can see that there is majority support for such a mission, and about a quarter of Canadians strongly support it. What's most interesting, or more interesting perhaps, is that we actually tested different ideas here about who would lead this mission to see if it would make a difference. And we found that it didn't really matter whether this mission was led by Britain and France, by the UN, by the US, or if we didn't even say who was leading the mission. And what it suggests is that, in fact, there is public support in principle for such peacemaking missions, and that people are not so hung up in terms of who would be leading it. And I think it's important to put this in a broader context. This is some trend data on a question about Canada's most important contribution to the world. And we can see that going back 20 years or so, that peacekeeping or peacemaking has always been the area where Canadians feel their country can make a contribution. And while it has declined over the last 20 years, from 40% to 20%, there has been no other notion that has really taken its place. The final bit of data is on friends and enemies. We presented 10 countries. We wanted to see the extent to which these were seen in relation to Canada. I'll just put them all up to do this quickly in the interest of time. You can see them all. No big surprises here. Great Britain, USA, France, almost all Canadians feel that they're friends. Mexico, India, Israel, China, not as quite large a majority feel that they're friends of Canada, but very few Canadians see them as enemies. Even when you get to China and Russia and Saudi Arabia, not a lot see those countries as adversaries per se. Until you get to Iran, the outlier, we needed to put some range here, does stand out, not seen by very many as a friend of Canada. 42% see as an enemy. Seems like a large or a small number depending on what you might expect. And just to finish up, we thought that, again, one more comparison with the United States, a similar kind of question asked by the Pew Center earlier this year. for some of the same countries, and you can see that what we hear about in terms of Americans supporting Israel, in fact, is true. 90% think that it's a friend of the country. The other surprising finding that I see here is how Canadians view Mexico, which is their neighbor to the south. Almost 1 in 5 Americans consider Mexico to be an enemy. That's kind of scary. Let me just finish up with a few final comments before I get yanked off the stage here. There's no way to sort of properly sum all this up into sort of one big answer or theme, but just to finish with a few minor observations or quick observations about what I think the research tells us. There is still a clear sense of collective responsibility in the society for those who are vulnerable and in need of assistance. We may wonder about that given the direction that governments and programs and society is taking us in different ways, but that strain still seems to be here. And there does seem to be an increasing acknowledgement of the plight and the challenges and the aspirations of Canada's Aboriginal peoples. It brings to mind what Sean Atleo said about what his granny told him back in 2008, that they are just beginning to hear us. This does provide some further evidence of that, in fact, is taking place. Human rights protection is not a particularly important or sensitive issue, I think, for most Canadians. Maybe it's great that we don't have to worry about that, like in other countries. But there is acknowledgement, there's widespread understanding that there is discrimination against many groups in our society, and that sense is not going down. At the same time, there are Canadians who do blame the victim, and I think it's fair to say that there is still bigotry and racism in this country, and it may not be prevalent, but it's still there. On the environment, I think it's fair to say that it's not a pressing concern among the public. And I would describe it as a symbolic issue, not a concrete issue, which would help explain why it's not a political issue and why people are not taking the streets. But that's where it stands at this point in time. At the same time, issues like climate change, or climate change in particular, are broadly acknowledged. People know about it, they do care about it, they are looking for action from their leaders, and they're not necessarily seeing it. So it's not as if the environment is not on the map at all. Canadians do want their country to be a force of good in the world. They have long felt that, and that sentiment has not really diminished over time. And there's still a willingness to send our troops out for some good cause if that's necessary. And finally, to finish, we don't really divide the world between friends and enemies, and I think that's a really good thing. So with that, I finish. Thank you very much.
Someone? Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Lily. Good morning. Thank you very much for your presentation. I don't know if this is a question, and it's difficult to pose questions, but can we say that new immigrants might be the more responsible citizens, given that they rank kind of higher on many concerns and issues?
That's an interesting question. Are new immigrants more responsible citizens? Well, I could get myself in trouble with this one.
Yes.
I guess it's the question of how do you decide who's a more responsible citizen? That's a tough one. What I can say, and what research that we and others have done are very clear, is that new immigrants, in some sense, are prouder Canadians. In a sense, they value, in some ways, this country and what it provides more than native people that have been native born. And so in a sense, they are perhaps more responsible citizens because they are more, I don't know if appreciative is the right word, but they really more take it to heart in a way and appreciate the uniqueness and the value of being Canadian in a way that some others perhaps take it for granted. So at that level, perhaps they are more responsible.
How do you define responsible citizenship in your research, actually?
Well, we didn't actually try and define responsible citizenship. You know, it's interesting that responsible citizenship is a bit of a value judgment. In terms of, I mean, it's the Trudeau theme, but in terms of what it means, I think that might be a broad discussion for the session in some ways. Yeah, so that was not something that we tried to address with this particular survey. That would take a whole survey in and of itself.
So go ahead.
Hi, my name is Karina Venesai. I'm a Trudeau scholar. I was wondering about your interpretation regarding the environment. You said at the end that you think it was more of a symbolic rather than concrete concern for Canadians. But based on your survey, what it really says is that in times of recession, people basically will put economy above the environment. That doesn't mean that ask the question, if you had the choice, if you had the opportunity to have your economic condition guaranteed, would you want the environment dealt with right now? They might have answered differently. So I was just wondering, how do you deal with these trade-offs when asking the questions? Because, you know, it might not be a future concern for them. It might just be that when asked to prioritize or in conditions that they feel insecure, they might take one choice rather than the other, but asking it slightly differently might have yielded a different answer.
That's a very good question. Well, first to clarify, the data that I was showing actually was focusing on what we would call salience of the environment, or what's a top of mind concern, which isn't quite the same thing as people's sort of expressed concern. It's sort of what's in people's mind, what they think of first. And I think it's fair to say in times of economic recession, people tend to think about the economy more than the environment and vice versa. But when you go beyond top of mind questions and you ask people about sort of level of concern, you can ask about the economy, you can ask about the environment, it's not as if people are less concerned about the environment than about the economy. And we have found in various surveys that people tend to reject the notion of a trade-off. People sort of bristle at the notion that they have to trade them off. I think this notion is sort of not accepted, and people feel that it should be possible to have both, and they would like to have both, and they don't necessarily accept the arguments that some may have that you have to. So it's not so much, you know, it's not so much that you need to let people, that you need to suggest that there is a economic security before they put the environment first. They do put the environment first already, but as I said, you know, the environment in many ways is in some sense more symbolic than personal and concrete. Jobs, the economy, their own welfare, economic welfare is something people viscerally feel and are worried about day to day. For most Canadians, not all, the environmental threats are not as present for them in such a direct way. So it doesn't have quite the same concrete impact, which is why it doesn't evoke the same kind of action or inaction. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much. So next question, we have two or more, I think. Oh, yeah.
Oh, Ron Graham, I'm a member of the Trudeau Foundation. I may have missed this at the beginning, but I was just curious on the human rights issues, whether your survey was done before the intense debate on the Quebec Charter of Values, and if so, or if either way, did you see any regional variations on the human rights issues?
It's another good question. The survey was from mid-September to mid-October, so clearly the charter was out there. You know, I'd have to actually go back to the numbers. There were no dramatic regional differences on that particular question that come to mind. I think if Quebec or some other part of the country had really stood out, it would have been in the presentation. It's a very general question, and it may be that, that the current situation in Quebec has not evolved to the point where people would necessarily, it would influence their views of that particular kind of question. But I will, after we're finished now, go back to my numbers and look more deeply, and if anybody's interested in the result, you can come talk to me.
Kent Roach, a Trudeau Fellow. a specific and a general question. The specific is, how confident are you of the differences on Aboriginal issues in the prairie provinces? Has this been replicated? Is the N, when you break it out regionally, sufficient? And a kind of more general issue is, I mean, is this a kind of red and blue state? And just generally, is there any support in your research for thesis of kind of increasing polarization, wedge issues, or is this more of a kind of elite phenomena?
A what phenomena?
A phenomena of the elites, kind of having wedge issues and polarization.
Well, the first question about the prairie provinces, and you know, the subsamples in the survey for the prairie provinces obviously are not as large as some bigger provinces. That being said, we have multiple questions, we have multiple data points, and we can even look at the 3 prairie provinces together. And I think if you look at all those factors, you can clearly say with some confidence that there is a difference, that views about Aboriginal issues in the prairie provinces are somewhat different than elsewhere. And I think there are good reasons for that. I think anybody that knows those provinces and the history and so forth can appreciate and might even expect that general public views would be somewhat different than they might be in Quebec or BC or somewhere else. And we've seen this on other surveys as well. As for polarization and wedge issues, there's other research on this I have not presented, which is on our website. It's quite clear that Canadian public opinion and Canadian values have not changed much in the last decade. I mean, there's been some evolution. We are not seeing increasing polarization, increasing wedge issues. There's certainly an ideological bent to the government in Ottawa that's been around for a while, but the data really clearly show that Canadian values and opinions are not bending to that agenda. Canadians are less concerned about crime than they were before. They're as concerned about the environment. They do want sort of an active foreign policy. And so by many of the measures that one could look at, it's clear that the opinions are kind of holding steady, and the government's political success is not based on sort of broad public mandate, but they do have their base, and we know how the political system works, and they've done very well by that.
Okay. So Joseph Heath, Trudeau Fellow. So I just wanted to share, first of all, a joke that my colleague Peter Lowe in the University of Toronto told, which is that, so he does a lot of survey research. So he defines forward nation now as people who support increased public spending, lower taxes, and balanced budgets. And
all for that.
He estimates they constitute about 30% of the electorate. But I guess one thing I'm struck by when I look at this is that clearly one thing that we've seen, particularly in the last 10, 20 years, is that there's a huge difference between the sort of general attitudes people have and then what you can actually mobilize people around. And that also you can get important shifts in when you move away from more abstract formulations towards endorsement of specific policies. You often wind up situations where large segments of the population support abstract objectives, but then reject every single policy measure that could actually get you there, right? So there was one particularly striking survey that was done of Americans where they showed them distributions of income and said, you know, what strikes you as being the ideal distribution of income in a society? And large majorities of Americans chose Sweden and categorically rejected the American model. And yet, of course, Americans consistently reject any kind of policy that might get them in that direction. And you had similar things with transit in Toronto, where people abstractly endorse solutions to the problem, but then reject every single policy that could get you there. So I guess I was wondering if in doing these things, what kind of tools are available? I mean, obviously you're not political strategists, but what kind of tools are available to you to see whether or not and to what degree any of this can be translated into concrete politics? So for example, like with climate change stuff, you know, I've seen some stuff where if you ask people, how much more are you willing to pay for gas in order to address climate change, you get really depressing results. Anyhow, so I was just wondering what sort of work you do in that area.
Well, I think you raise a good distinction between broad views and sentiments, which in many cases may be aspirations and very specific policies. I think the first thing I would say is that, I mean, it is kind of a disjuncture, and you could look at it and say, well, people are being inconsistent, and at some level it is. But I suspect that part of what's going on is people may have broad views about things which they truly believe. When you get into the specifics, then you start introducing other factors. And how they respond to a specific initiative like a subway or something else may have a lot to do with their views about who is actually proposing it and opposing it. So the actual credibility and how they view the actors, and there may be a policy that is different than the one that they believe in broad terms, but if it's being espoused by some politician or some leader or somebody who they actually sort of have some credibility in, that may shift it. There may also be a tendency for people to be critical or negative or cynical about specific proposals because they don't have confidence that governments or others are actually going to be able to deliver. I think there's a fair amount of cynicism about the ability of governments and so forth for things that are planned to actually go forth. So I think when you get from the broad to the specific, you get into the details, and then other factors and other issues happen in terms of who you believe and your trust in institutions and things like that. So I think that would help explain it at some level. I think, you know, in terms of tools and so forth, I mean, this is very broad level, high level research, as high as you'd want to get. Certainly there are ways of doing research on specific issues with local populations where you can be much more sophisticated and you can test ideas and you can sort of figure out where you may be able to develop messages and so forth. A lot of these tools and things are used very effectively in politics. So there are a lot of things that you can do. But even with all of that, it doesn't mean that you can shift public opinion. I think the notion that if you simply provide enough information or you give the right narrative or you kind of position things a certain way, you'll bring people on side is a notion that, you know, sometimes that happens, but a lot of times people are resistant to that kind of change. Not sure it fully answers your question, but it's a start.
Thank you so much, Keith. We have so much to think about all these amazing results. So we have to stop here. Thank you so much for your participation and for being part of this conversation. Thank you.